next 10 minutes or so is share 3 learnings about what I've learned about strategy over the last 10 years. And, my experience are nowhere close to, I think, what the rest of the panelists are in terms of breadth of experience. But I'll share a little bit in terms of what I've seen from the outside. I think there's a very interesting set of insights and analysis that showed that the role of external consultants in strategy formulation is very limited. And I actually fully subscribe to that, by the way. Right? It should be that way. I think it's, external consultants should be nothing but stimuli or catalysts in terms of really holding a mirror, but ultimately it's the management and the board which needs to take accountability for what the strategy should be. So the first learning is actually around strategy needs to deal with the notion of uncertainty. And one of my favorite examples is actually going back to, I do a lot of work in insurance and financial services. And I always look back to the entire 2008-2009 period. Right? Between 2008 and 2008, the insurance industry, particularly the life insurance industry, was a darling of pretty much everybody. Investors, analysts, multinational companies looking to actually enter into the market because the market was growing at 30% plus. Valuations had reached sky-high levels. There was no basis for valuation because all these companies were making losses. And break-even had still not been reached even after kind of 8 years. But still everybody was riding on the India growth story, everybody was riding on the equity markets and capital markets story, and therefore willing to pump in enormous amount of investment, right? Investment in setting up branches, investment in actually recruiting people, because they thought that the growth was actually going to continue for the next 20 years, right? Then actually came a serious shock to the industry, a shock like the industry had never seen before. And by the way, this is not even the financial crisis. Right? This is a shock which is actually externally induced. This is a shock which came in the form of massive regulatory changes. And everything went for a toss, right? Break-even assumptions went for a toss, the profit assumptions went for a toss, growth assumptions went for a toss. And the industry actually has gone through a stage of, I would call, steady decline since 2009. What went wrong, right? I think what went wrong is that if you really unpeel the onion and look at the strategies which most companies had put into place around that time, 2005, 2006, it was in the premise that growth would actually continue. And a lot of the resource allocation and the investments were actually on that particular premise. But what they didn't account for was the entire uncertainty in in what would happen in the environment. And therefore, I think one of the big learnings which I personally had, and frankly, I think having been in some of these discussions, we've probably also been guilty of actually being overtly optimistic about what the future would hold. One of the big learnings for me personally in terms of what this experience actually holds is in terms of how do you really create a strategy that is well tuned to deal with uncertainty. And there are 2-3 things which are really important over there. One is there's no real such thing as a long-term strategy, right? Because strategy is relative, strategy needs to be dynamic and adaptive to changes in the external environment. And therefore this notion of what we call a trigger-based approach, right? How do you kind of continue to monitor the external environment for what's really happening? And then dynamically adjust your resource plan, your capital plan to actually, watch for certain triggers, watch for certain inflection points which will actually happen in the environment, and then adjust your strategy accordingly. I think that's one important learning in terms of how do you deal with uncertainty. The second learning is in terms of how do you really think about, not a broad-based set of actions which you need to take, but in many ways a portfolio of bets which you're actually making. Initiatives or actions which what we would call the no-regret moves, right? Which you do irrespective of what happens in the environment because they're going to be steady, stable, carry you through the environment. But then really also placing 1 or 2 big bets which you're actually making, but moderating the amount of capital, moderating the amount of resources you're actually allocating to these big bets, which you can dial up or dial down depending on what happens in the external environment. So how do you create a strategy which is a good balance between what we call no-regret moves, big bets, and options for the future which you can trigger when certain changes actually happen in the external environment. So that's the first set of learning for me in terms of how do you really create a strategy that can deal with uncertainty. And I think to me, having gone through the experience of the insurance industry as an outside practitioner, that's a learning which is even more relevant and practical as you go towards in the future. Particularly because I think over the next 10 years, we're going to continue to live in an extremely volatile and uncertain environment. And therefore, the strategy needs to be tailored to deal with an uncertain environment. The second learning on strategy is actually around how do you create a strategy that will truly beat the market. Right? I think a lot of times we have organizations come up with strategies which are me too, non-differentiated, and as a result, I think you see institutions not delivering the level of performance which they had originally set out to deliver. There are 2-3 things, again, I think from my learning, which characterizes how do you create something which beats the market. The first learning is in terms of, can you build upon some source of what we call positional advantage? And let me illustrate this with an example which is actually not from the business world at all. So Roger Federer, all of you would have obviously heard about Roger Federer. Roger Federer obviously is one of the highest paid athletes in the history of sport, right? And he's probably the second highest paid athlete in the world today. He makes around $50 million a year from endorsements and from obviously his prize meetings. Right? And obviously, if you ask why Roger Federer actually earns that much amount of money, a lot of people would actually say because he's Roger Federer, he has skills that are at a different level. Obviously, one would argue that at this point of time, but he's built up his skills, and that skills give him a natural advantage, right? But if you ask the same question in terms of if you were to take Roger Federer, right, and Roger Federer had to play badminton, would he earn the same amount of money? Right? And when we actually try to discern this a little bit, right, and as we can see, we like to do all sorts of analysis. So we also did an analysis in terms of what would happen if Roger Federer were actually a badminton player, right? How much would he actually make? And there's an interesting slide which I'm not carrying, but I'll probably kind of share that with you. So what we found out is that the biggest source of advantage which Roger Federer had was just the fact that he was playing tennis, right, and not the fact that he was playing badminton. Because we look at the average earnings of the top 10 players in badminton, it was $1 million. But the average earnings of the top 10 players in tennis was $20 million, right? So there was a 20x lift which he got just by being a tennis player, right? And then the advantage which he had of being Roger Federer in tennis was only 2x as compared to the average of the rest. So this is actually about being in the right place and building upon your positional advantage. The second learning on what will it take to beat the market is actually around do you have some real source of privileged insight, right? And often what we figure out is that people don't even know what insight they actually have. So there's an example of a bank which I've had the opportunity to actually look at for quite a long period of time, which has done remarkably well over the last 10 years, right? And it's probably won several awards, I think, in terms of growth, value creation, profits. And every year when there's an annual conference of the bank, the key sales guys and the retail banking distribution heads are always applauded and featured and acknowledged, saying that it's because of you, it's because of your efforts that the bank is actually doing quite well. Right? Then a group of people in the bank decided to figure out what's really happening in the bank. Right? So they went a little deeper to really understand, how are our branches doing, how are we performing relative to the market. What they found out that in the 90% of the markets the branch was actually present in, the individual branches were losing market share. Right? But the bank as a whole was still growing, and the bank as a whole was still growing faster than the market, right? Now what contributed to this? So once they disaggregated this further, what they found out is that, over the last 5 years, every branch which the bank had actually put into place, right, was in the highest growth potential spots in the market. And the bank had a disproportionate share of branches in the fastest growing markets of the country than any other bank in the country. So even while the bank was relatively losing market share in each of these markets, because the market itself was growing at 2x or 3x of the rest of the places in the country, the bank as a whole was actually gaining market share, right? And this could solely be attributed to two people actually sitting in the retail banking strategy group who had figured out that this is the way to actually gain competitive advantage, and this is how the bank should actually be. So often I think this is a source of insight, which is a privileged insight, but the bank didn't even know that it was a source of privileged insight, right? And it was a disproportionate share of what was causing the performance. So that's the second learning for me in terms of how do you actually deal with how do you really create some source of competitive advantage which beats the market, right? Whether you have but the fact that you are in a position or the fact that you have some privileged insight. Third learning for me, I think it gels well with what Arvind describes earlier in terms of strategy is as much about not doing a few things than about doing a few things. Often I think organizations, and personally I've had the chance to experience this, get things wrong because they just want to do too many things. I think the reality is that resources are limited, whether it's financial capital resources or human capital resources or n number of other technology resources. And it's really about kind of placing your bet in the 2-3 things which you think will make a difference, but being very explicit about the 2-3 things which you're not going to do at any cost. Right? Another financial institution which I've had the opportunity to actually look at and work with for a long period of time. What we figured out is that, over the last 10 years, they're actually, in their aspirations to become a universal supermarket, had probably got into every damn business, right? Whether it was corporate banking, whether it was investment banking, whether it was retail banking, whether it was international, they had opened branches in every geography in the country. And ultimately, I think the bank had become a hodgepodge, right? So one of the things the bank actually did was to kind of go back to its core. It retreated from 4 businesses. It retreated from, 20 geographies which it had no business being in, and really doubled down focus on the 2-3 core markets where it had a real source of competitive advantage, right? It was a tough call to make. It was a tough call to make that I will not do certain things, but ultimately I think that's now the bank is back on track. Right? So I think in sum and substance, there are many learnings I think one has as has gone through various exercises over the last 10 years. But I think the 3 things which I can recall and I think will be hopefully relevant for you as you go about in your careers, which in terms of how do you really create something that can deal with uncertainty. 2 is how do you really make sure that your strategy will beat the market, because it's all about relative, less about absolute. And 3rd is how do you make sure that strategy is as much about not doing certain things than about doing certain things. Thank you very much.
It's relative enough. It's a blend of the economic conditions and the market. But what I am trying to understand is, if I have to exemplify what Tata Nano, as Auto Expo has just passed out, Tata has made a strategy for Nano being as the cheapest car, and the positioning, as you pointed out, the positioning. The strategy for any company will be on 2 things, either to gain competitive advantage or to attract more customers. How difficult it is to change a strategy, especially in the mindset of the consumer, when you have already established?
I think the trap organizations get into is that they commit so hard to a strategy that it becomes very difficult to actually steer away from that. Right? It's almost like saying that you're trying to steer a super tanker away at 45 degrees. It's very difficult to actually make that happen. Which is why I think my firm belief is that you need to have a strategy flexible enough for you to adapt and react to changes in the external environment. Obviously, there needs to be some amount of core beliefs, core values, core ethics which you actually need to stand for. But at the same time, I think it's very important that you create enough flexibility, right, in the way you formulated a strategy to respond to changes. And I think this has particularly become more relevant in the last 5 years, right? I think the biggest learning from the economic and financial crisis of the last 5 years is that this uncertainty is going to continue for the next 2 decades, right? And God knows how much more after that, right? And therefore it becomes even more pertinent to actually create something which is tuned to deal with uncertainty and can change in tune with changes in the external environment. I think you increasingly are seeing consumer preferences change at a pace which is unheard of earlier. Right? If strategies cannot kind of account for that, then I think strategies will fail. Technology is a classic example, right? I think we talked about there was this messaging or social media service called MySpace 6 years back, right? And who's heard of MySpace now, right? Then came Facebook, then came Twitter. Now suddenly everybody's talking about the instant messaging services, right? I mean, the reality in 2 years' time may be very different, right? And therefore, I think how to keep ahead of the environment and keep changing being nimble enough to change your strategy becomes very important. I think the example you mentioned is probably a classic case. They probably went a little bit too far, right? Now they're forced to change, but it's not going to be easy, right? Because I think once you commit yourself down a path, it's not very easy to kind of steer away.
Kind of create a parallel brand image. So like for Nano, right now they're trying to stay away from Nano or go away from Nano. It may be difficult. So but can they do like putting another brand like Toyota and Lexus so that they can take the advantage of both the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, several institutions which have tried to kind of break free from their traditional shackles and actually created brands which are probably kind of appeal to a very different segment of the population. So I think the point which is important is that the market will force you to change, right? And you either change in your current avatar or you find a new avatar to kind of make the change happen. But the reality is, if you don't do that, then you'll become redundant.
If you think about it, it's very difficult to have a final view as to what happened to Nano. If you remember when Nano was launched, everybody was very excited and there was some whopping numbers of bookings that was done, which got cancelled after about a year or so. It's considered to be the largest volume selling car. But what is emerging is that people first wanted a car and then they wanted a price of 1 lakh. Not 1 lakh and whatever you give me in 1 lakh. That didn't work for them. It was like, it was not fulfilling their aspiration to actually drive a car. So somewhere there it missed out, it got a lot of negative feedback, maybe execution was an issue. But I'm sure they're working on it and they will find some place for that car to settle down. And you also see this, the other car that they launched, Tata's launched, which is it Indica? I think Indica. So what happened to Indica is it was a very good car, very good price, great economy. But over a period of time, it's become the lowest cost taxi. It's got a taxi image. To an extent, Innova is also having the same image. Innova is the most popular car for taking people from one place to the other, not like a self-driven car. Now, I don't think Toyota would have thought of it from that perspective. But once you start having some of those labels, which could be by sheer accident, affects the way the product does later on.
That's three important topics, 3 important points rather. I was just thinking about what happened with Macintosh at that point of time, because what I can actually see is Apple had all the 3 things defined at that moment of time: right timing, positioning, and they decided only with personal homemade PCs to be delivered. Everything was there, but still Microsoft took over. It's just it was not. Do you think rather than there should be one more thing, additional thing like a speed or something was missing in the whole strategy, because all the 3 things that you had already mentioned was there in their execution. So still it actually didn't work out.
By the way, the 3 things I mentioned, these are 3 in many ways tenets, which are part of many other tenets which have actually picked up in the years of helping institutions formulate strategy. But I think the one thing I didn't touch upon enough, and some of my fellow panelists will talk about it much more because they've been practitioners, is ultimately you can have the best strategy, but the best strategy comes to naught if you don't have the right resources as well as the commitment and the right execution behind it. Right? And I think that's where you'll see a big gap between people who found good strategies but not being able to follow through enough. And not being able to follow through because they've not been committed in terms of allocating sufficient resources, or it's just in terms of they've not been diligent enough in terms of execution. So I think in this particular case, and it's an interesting example you mentioned, because I think right now the story is actually reversed again, right? Given that we all know where Apple stands vis-a-vis Microsoft. So these things also evolve over a period of time. Right? 10 years down the line, we will be having a completely different discussion again.
At that point of time, they were pioneers actually.
Yeah.
But still they failed. I think they had all the 3 things on.
I don't know whether you should call it failure, right? If you look back at it at this point of time, I wouldn't say you would call it a failure.
So that's the last question. At the back, please.
My name is Nitish. I believe that it will succeed. But for how long will you wait to change the strategy? For example, when we take the example of Nokia, it stuck with its strategy, but eventually the company failed. So for how long will you wait to change the strategy?
I wish I had an antidote.
Okay, thanks Ramna. Can we now have Rajni?
So thank you very much. These are encouragement claps for me, so thank you. So I will speak from my experience with 2 very different companies, but with a strong sense of purpose and value. I had the advantage of working with 2 companies when they were very small, developing their strategy explicitly, implicitly, and then they have grown into multi-billion corporations in a period of 20 to 30 years. So the first company, and as I worked through these companies, I realized that strategy basically is just to define where you want to go and how you want to get there. And more often than not, where you want to go is that you want to maximize stakeholder value. You can define it in any form that you want. Now, how you get there? Do you get through a market leadership position? Do you get through globalization? Do you get through focus? Is something that you define for each company. So it's the DNA of each company on how you want to execute it. So one company which I worked with was a pharmaceutical company called Dr. Reddy's. Most of us know this company. It's an Indian company, started 30 years back. Was very, very small when I joined them. I guess it was about 300 crores, or it's about 10,000 at the moment. Started with a motto of saying we'll help people lead healthier lives. So this became a strong sense of purpose for every single person working within the company. to say, yes, I want to contribute to make people lead healthier lives. So that was a good enough thing to make sure that the right platform was set for execution. Had first started off with the strategy of making bulk active pharmaceuticals. Basically you can create them in a drum and sell them in India. It's a powder form of drug. And then they said, yes, in line with my vision to help people make their lives healthier, I need to make some affordable medicines in the country. And that's how they expanded into the strategy of making copy formulated drugs. And these are copy drugs. They're not something which was innovated by Dr. Reddy's. There was a loop in the framework of the World Trade Organization. And they started making, they were the pioneers to start making these formulations in the country at a 1/100th of a price of what was sold internationally. Tasted success, worked brilliantly well, made huge profits. You can imagine a very young company started by a research scientist, and then they said, fine, now that we have captured the Indian market, let's expand to the international markets. And that's when they moved and touched first the markets of Russia. Russia those days was deprivatizing their pharma sector, so there was a good opportunity for companies to enter there. The same product, which was generating 100 rupees here, started generating 600 rupees in Russia. So it was a fantastic strategy. Started going very slow and said, fine, let's enter very slow with 4 or 5 people of representative office, and made loads of money in Russia in those days. I'm speaking about 85 to 90s, 91 before the ruble collapsed. Well, if it can work in Russia, it can work in the US. We have very smart scientists, engineers, and we started creating products to challenge the US patents. Again, hugely successful. It was one of the first companies which challenged one of the patents, got an exclusivity, made I think $80 million of profit in one quarter. Most of us got bumper bonus, for that quarter because we contributed to that. So as we started growing, it proved out to be an extremely well structured strategy. We got a bit of arrogance in terms of saying, we know how to expand now, we know how to get there. And then we went and got hold of expanding into the Western European market. Very, very different from the CIS zone, extremely different from US, which is highly regulated. Western Europe has its own market characteristics. So the arrogance of success, entry into Western Europe, acquired knowing fully that it's a branded market, and when it's a branded market, there's a sense of pride, there's a premium that you can command, and we said when it's branded, we need to pay a lot of money. So we acquired a company called Beta Pharm at 480 million euros of valuation, which those days was 40% of the market cap of Dr. Reddy's as a whole. Acquired the company, and for the rest of the 4 quarters, reported a loss from the European operations. So it was not so much about saying, did they have a strategy in place? Was it tested? Did it work? Yes, of course it did. For the last 2 decades, it worked extremely well in the Indian market and worked extremely well in the American markets as well. Why did it not work in the European market? Because in this case, it was not granular enough. It used an already applied model and tested model in other markets and tried to replicate into a market where we did not do the right amount of due diligence from a market point of view. So I remember extremely well, we acquired the company in November 95, and in March 96, the law changed, completely taking away the advantage of having a branded presence in the European market. So the company, which was valued at 480 million, I guess must have become 100 million overnight. So it was first quarter of acquisition was zero EBITDA. So goes back to say it's not enough to have a strategy, it's not enough to execute it well, but it's also extremely important to make sure that every time you approach a strategic move, you need to have the same level of diligence as you had in the past. Maybe an extra mile to understand the feedback mechanism that comes from the market. Remove the arrogance of been there, done that, and get as granular as you can. But having said that, after 2 quarters, they adapted themselves extremely well, and they have turned back, and now they are again very, very highly successful with a high degree of market cap. The second company which I work for and where I work now is, and I see my colleague here sitting as well, is Schneider Electric. Again, an extremely noble cause of energy management in a time when resources is scarce. Would you want to work for a diesel-leaking company, or would you want to work for an energy management? We have a sense of pride. We help the people make the most of our energy. We help people to do more with less. So a very strong rallying cry, and a strategy very different from Dr. Reddy's, where it was an India plus model, and in Schneider Electric, where it was a global minus model to come into the country and expand into the country. Now, Schneider's stated strategy globally is to grow. We strongly believe that if you are a leader in a market, and we really believe it's in our system, if you are a leader in a market, you can command a premium, by definition. So the strive is to reach a leadership position. Now how do you reach a leadership position in a segment or a product or a family? We strongly believe, very, very strongly, that it is through acquisitions. We have done close to 150 acquisitions in 10 years. You can imagine, so if anybody who asks us, are you from Schneider? Yes, I come from Malinjaran, I come from American Power. So there's no real Schneider face left. It's a lot of acquisitions coming together, and it's a stated strategy to say that we will grow through acquisitions. Inorganic, leadership position, extremely fast track growth, because as you acquire, you start to build. Again, work very well in some markets, but when you come and replicate the same strategy in the Indian market, in a scenario which was extremely fast growing, new economies, etc. Today we stand at a cusp where we have done 8 acquisitions in the last 5 years. I guess one of them is generating the value that it was scheduled to generate, full value. The rest of them are cash dilutive, has an issue with the market presence, has an issue with applying the acquisition formula of global guys, where you really do not understand that in India, if you're dealing with government business, it is not a space where Schneider can operate. So really adapting to the local market and saying, what is it that I need to do for the local market? Do I have that in place? Is my strategy granular enough to say what I'm acquiring is really possible to be integrated into the company and to generate the value that it needs to generate? So this is my experience from 2 companies. I guess I want to leave my session more for Q&A. Again, both companies are highly successful. I don't want to give you an impression that both of them have failed today. Both of them are surprisingly of the same size in India. One is 25, 30 years old, the other one is 50 years old. Both of them surprisingly at the same level of revenue in India. Very, very different levels of profitability. The Indian company by nature is extremely much more profitable than the global one, but still highly successful and generating what they need to do. So my takeaway from these learnings that I had, and I have grown with these companies, one from 400 to 10,000 crores, other from $100 million through to 700 million euros in a span of 7 years, so exponential growth. So my sense is, first and foremost, it's extremely important for a strategy to have a purpose. You can have whatever you have in the document. If you don't have a rallying cry where you lead the employees and say this is what you need to go, because finally they are the ones to execute, it is a sure shot failure. There needs to be an extremely high level of granularity. And with that level of granularity, the direction also has to be extremely granular. You cannot say, I'll give you an example again of Schneider. We are a company which operates a lot in a product space, which is a very different model of distribution. You sell it to your distributors who sell it upfront, you get the money back in 30, 45 days, you basically don't need to do anything. We said, you know what, we want to move where we understand the customer's energy needs and when we want to make solutions for them. That means we want to take the complexity from the customers into us. So I said, fine, how do we go to solution business? So we got global targets in 2009, said, you know what guys, the solution business has to grow at least 10 points higher than the products business is growing. Very good. The first year, the solution business in the company grew 20 points higher than what it was growing. In the process, everybody forgot to mention very clearly that, guys, while it is growing, while you're bringing the complexity, you also need to make sure that you collect the cash. You also need to make sure that the solution business that you're growing is profitable, and at some point of time, you need to stop buying references and you need to generate profit from this engine. So 2009, great show on top line. 2010, disaster in the stock market at France level, because we had to explain to the shareholders why the EBITDA margin was dropping. We learned 2010, we turned back, and so it teaches you that it needs to be extremely granular, not only in terms of defining, but also in terms of explaining what really needs to be executed. And the last important thing is adaptability and course correction. It needs to be fast. There's no common thread to say, should you stop this business if it's not making a profit in 1 quarter or 2 quarters. There's no one formula fits all for this case. It's more intuitive with the people on the ground. If you have your ears to the ground, you understand what's happening in the market space, you will know intuitively and very quickly when to exit or when to correct your course. So that is extremely important, to stop doing some things or to correct the course of what you're doing if you see it's not going according to plan. So now I'll open it for questions.
A broad vision and they define their mission and then their strategy. So in a large organization where there is a lot of departmentalization and departments are working in silos, and also they might be having different strategies. So how do you ensure alignment of different strategies strategies to the overarching business strategy at every level and at every point of time?
For me, I can tell you what has happened in the organization where it has worked, and this is only through communication. There's nothing else which can replace communication to defining that the whole organization is aligned to this rallying cry that you want to achieve the goal that you want to have. Everything has to tie into the end purpose of generating higher stakeholder value. I'll tell you this with an example. Going back to Dr. Reddy's, we were highly successful in challenging some patents for US drugs, and fluoxetine was the case those days. And then they said, you know what, it's such a lot of money in this case. Let's make sure that we have 15 filings every year for challenging patents. So, on the 31st of March, actually not 31st, on the 25th of March, the R&D team would take truckloads of data and go to the US FDA to make sure that the filings are done. The guy would make his bonus, 200, 300%, and April, May, June, typically like a sales return, they'll come back with saying you have this gaps, and we finally never had one more challenger drug for many, many years to come. It was important to know, why do you want to file? Why is it that you need to get there? So you need to define and communicate what exactly is needed to achieve the company purpose. And this has to happen in every discussion forum that is relevant for the company, whether it's operational or strategy. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Just to add to what Rajni just said, one of the things that department heads have to do is to live with a sub-optimized model. So marketing may have to sub-optimize what is the optimum marketing plan to do what is optimum for the organization. Manufacturing will have to sub-optimize. And generally, cross-functional conflicts happen because every department wants to optimize their functional model, but that cannot be optimum for the organization.
Lots of HR questions for finance.
Yeah. So I recently read an article by Peter Drucker which said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So according to you, how important is culture to formulate and implement a strategy, and what role does culture plays to solve complex problems related to strategy?
It's a HR topic. Organization, I cannot speak in the jargon of HR. I really am a finance person in my heart. I can speak numbers. But culture is the foundation for everything you do. When I spoke of having a purpose, of having values and saying this is the common goal that we want to go, one of the things that we do also in Schneider, 150 acquisitions that we have done, most of them failed on the financial parameters, but none of them failed on the cultural parameters. If you do not have a strategic fit for culture, you cannot build a strategy. You cannot build a strategic document for growth of your company. It's extremely important to have a common culture and a synergistic culture within the company. So it's the foundation for any strategy. Does it answer you? Thank you. Sorry.
And you should also consider attending Dr. Lilac Nakum, some of her sessions, because I was there in the last class and she was talking exactly about the issue of culture when you're talking about building a cross-border enterprise. I'm sure you'll cover some of that when you're present.
Yeah, on an interesting note, we had done an acquisition in Germany, and when we had, it's very common for us to say in India, "Kya yaar, Hitler ke jaisa karta hai." So, we had this president for European operations who came and he was sitting at a management meeting. Hitler ke jaise karte ho? Why do you behave like a Hitler? So we were in a management meeting in Munich, and the ex-CEO of the company was there, and they were putting something, and the guy was very strong. He said, "Why are you behaving like Hitler?" Oh my goodness, it was a real disaster for weeks and months afterwards. Because for them it was extremely personal to be linked to somebody like Hitler for that culture. So it's important. I remember that one. It took weeks for us to get over with HR intervention and whatnot to fix that. I have to.
Sorry, actually, my question has more or less been answered.
It was HR question.
It's another HR question. But the question was, you acquired 150 companies.
Yeah.
How do you integrate people from 150 companies into your company and get them to follow a common culture, as you said? How do you fuse that culture? What does HR do to achieve that?
So, one of the extremely strong work streams.
Did everybody get the question? They wouldn't have heard.
Yeah, it was to say how. Yeah, he has a mic.
Yeah. The question was, The question was, company has acquired 150 organizations. How do you integrate 150 companies into your organization from a cultural standpoint in order that they all buy into the same strategy and the same future for the organization? Sounds like an extremely difficult HR task.
Yes.
So what does HR do?
Also, it's actually a management task more than an HR task, As a management, we're very French. By definition, European companies are pro-people, and then afterwards come the company priorities, etc. So it can be a fair amount of disaster when you want to execute something. When you want to motivate people, most of the people are highly motivated at all times. So whenever we look at an acquisition file, we spend a lot of time trying to understand and spend time with the top management, leaders, to understand if the values are the same for that company versus this. The foundation is the values. Openness, transparency. These are extremely, extremely important for us. And we spend an inordinate amount of time along with the financial due diligence and etc. And by now, we don't spend enough time on market due diligence. But we spend a lot of time to put the file together and create this cohesiveness to understand that this company is a cultural fit. And only if that box is ticked do we go ahead and acquire. In the past, we did have experience. And after the acquisition, we spend a huge amount of time in integrating the people. By cross-pollinating leaders from here to there and from the other company to here as well. So today, for example, the leader of India is somebody who came through an acquisition just 3 years back. He's leading the India business. It was led earlier by a Schneider Electric person who worked in Schneider Electric for 20 years. So it shows the strong amount of faith that you impose on your employees and say, I'm willing to take you around and I'm willing to walk the talk. So even for the global CEO, it starts with him and it goes through the whole system. We pride ourselves on people skills. So it's an extremely strong trait within Schneider.
So also just to add to what Rajni said, Ramnath talked about source of privileged insight. For Schneider, this is their privileged insight. They're very good at it. That's built it as a competency. All right, last question.
My question relates to the observation that you made regarding acquisition of the European company and of course the change in the regulatory practice that happened within a short span of time. Do you think that while sensing this particular change, because in Europe change comes after a lot of deliberation, and therefore how did you miss this particular regulatory change? And my second question, which is more important today, is that the entire world is gearing up against India's pharma sector. How do you think we can take on that challenge, and what do you have to say?
The entire world is gearing up against India pharma sector or only Ranbaxy?
No, I think it's not only
Sorry, no.
It is against, I think all the companies I read Wall Street Journal that this is happening all over. So we're going to have a mass,
So in
Russia, everybody else is coming against.
So I may not be able to answer authentically the second part. I have been out of pharma for 5.5 years, but for the first part, in defense of Dr. Reddy's, this change was on the table for some time. Happened very fast, but it took quarter on quarter, So it happened in March, and then it happened in June, and in September it was completely gone. The system completely changed. There was a slight amount of arrogance that we had in terms of knowing that we know how to operate in international markets. So the market due diligence and the science which the market was sending out in terms of changing from a doctor prescribed model to a pharmacy model was something we did not interpret and read with the kind of seriousness that we had to read. So that's really a fault in the process that we had from an M&A side. After some time, this acquisition was done within 80 days, from the start of the first management meeting to the closure. 80 days of sitting, flying first class, flying around, so that euphoria was too high. Ranbaxy was in the competition, so we wanted to make sure that we don't lose the deal. So it was surely a big gap from a due diligence side on that one. So we cannot take away that, and it came with a bit of arrogance from what we had done in the past, of how successfully we have expanded in the markets of CIS and the US. The second part on what Indian pharmaceutical companies need to do to stay competitive, I guess I will not be able to answer that authentically, but I can give you from my past experience. Indian pharmaceutical company has gone through a lot of consolidation in the previous years, through global acquisitions, through forward integration. So most of the companies, other than a select few, are actually held by by global guys, and we are more and more getting converted into a kind of manufacturing hub for the globe, rather than people who are able to generate the end market valuations. So how do you survive? I won't be able to know. Maybe just to make sure that we deliver what we commit and we stop making things at the backyard. I would not be able to give you an authentic answer. I'm sorry for that one, because it's very specific to the industry. Is there one more? We'll stop this.
Rajni, thank you very much.
Represent a company that is, I would say, about 10 years old and a company that is about 175 years old. This is the Times of India group, and the success of a group like this, I think, is largely because of the strategies that were deployed. I also have a presentation, if that can come on. Okay. The reason why I mentioned the Times of India group is that I think it's a unique experience working in a group like this, because there's a huge legacy that we carry. The 175-year-old legacy is it's an enterprise, and an enterprise has a brand value which it has to protect, which it has to carry forward. But you need to be nimble and on your toes always to be able to succeed in a market that is so competitive like the Indian media market. So the success here is that created enterprise. The enterprise creates entrepreneurs within the organization. Today we have roughly about 30 to 35 businesses, each of them functioning as small individual experimental entrepreneurial ventures, and these are young, nimble organizations with young, nimble workforces. You can take decisions quickly. You can afford to fail. The important thing is that the enterprise cannot afford to fail. But the entrepreneur can afford to fail. That is not really a failure. That is a step in the right direction. You make mistakes, you retract, you go back and say what went wrong, and then you try and change it and say, now let me revise my strategy. And after maybe 3-4 years, it comes back as part of the enterprise in a form that is successful in the marketplace. As a research person, how can I do without a presentation, right? Let me quickly say, what are the key issues when you talk about strategy? You have to know where we are going, how do we get there, what are the challenges, what are we up against, and actually what is their final goal, and when do we expect to achieve it. As the young entrepreneurs within the enterprise, we actually go with this. We figure out what our goal is, how do we reach there, when do we reach there, what is the market situation. If the market changes, there is some other entrepreneur within the organization that you can draw experiences from and then go on with it. And who is to frame it? Is it the CXO levels, the middle management, the senior management, or is it egalitarian and there's change at every level? Every person determines a strategy which plugs into the system and carries on. It's important to chart the process. You know, the strategy to process. It's an idea that it really starts. And then the strategy is what lends it direction and takes it to action. You have to define the process. Many good ideas are lost because you did not define either a goal or the action which leads you to that goal. You have to set milestones. A strategy and a vision that says that I want to be a market leader is not sufficient. Set short-term strategies, small milestones that are achievable, so that there is, the feeling of euphoria of having achieved at every point of time. And if you miss a milestone, that's all right. There's another short-term milestone which leads to the long-term goal. And then you create measures of success. If I have done something, how do I know that I have been successful? Every short-term milestone should have a metric for success. It can be data, it can be success, it can be various things. You may have changed the way the consumer behaves, but whatever you do, you must know why you think you have been successful or not successful. Now, if you make a mistake, you should have the freedom to course correct. Everybody makes mistakes, and it is okay to make mistakes. In fact, one of the business leaders from the Silicon Valley whom I spoke to, one of the things he mentioned was, Silicon Valley has such a high rate of success because the rate of failure is very, very high. And it's just okay to make mistakes. And then shift to the next year. You must know when to shift. If you, something good, if you carry on for too long, you have actually missed the bus and somebody else didn't have the first mover advantage, but then because you were scared to move to the next level, somebody else took the advantage away. What is that outcome of success? You have to interpret. Is it business success? Is it a leadership position? Do you change the course of the industry itself? Which the Times Group, by the way, did. When I joined the Times Group, it was very early in 1987. We were not even, the Indian industry had not even opened up and globalized. But at that point of time, we were a big, lumbering organization with other businesses offsetting the losses from the media industry. And we had the young Samir Jain, who came in and said that I will make this the most profitable of my businesses. And the veterans laughed at him and said, this guy has lost his marbles. Very, very slowly, very, very consciously, he changed not only the Times of India, but the entire Indian media industry, which is actually held up as a model of how the media industry can succeed. And that is largely by way of innovation. And then growth in size. You have to grow to a size that you can manage. You can't mindlessly grow. You have to then compartmentalize the growth, like I said, the entrepreneurs within the enterprise. And then create new benchmarks. If you have achieved something, let that be a, let that be a benchmark, and then rise to another level which creates a new benchmark. You cannot rest on your laurels. You have to constantly innovate and change. I thought I'd step back and think of what are the 3 generic strategies that you can deploy. One is cost leadership, differentiation, or focus. Each of these, there are many sub strategies that you can adopt. Then you go for market position and strategy. If you're a market leader, you have to defend a position. If you're a market challenger, you have a lot of freedom to do things that the market leader cannot do. And when you go to a market niche, you have to make the market size profitable, you have to focus on the markets, negligible markets. You know that when you're in a niche, there are going to be challengers to your niche. So constantly innovate. And when you look at market intelligence, I think many of us spoke about this, listen to the noise in the market. It may just be a murmur, but listen to it and pay heed to it, because ultimately the consumer is whom you're working for. The stakeholder value is what you're trying to achieve. But to reach that stakeholder value, you have to work with the consumer, whoever your consumer is, whoever your client is. And if you listen to that noise in the market, there are chances that you'll rarely go wrong. So what is the competition? You have to understand your operating environment. You have to forecast your environment, identify your core strengths and weaknesses, and then with the ongoing intelligence, you have to meet the changing environment. You can't ignore the change in the environment. And when you implement the strategy, you have to execute at the mid-level, because really the operational level buy-in is very important. As business leaders, you can evolve a strategy to change. The juniors are way too junior to make a difference. But that middle operational level, never underestimate the power of that level. Train them, communicate with them, take their inputs. They have their ear to the ground. They know what's happening in the market. That level is what you must listen to understand what's happening in your market. When you have a lack of strategy, what really happens is you have no clear path. There is a lot of activity happening, but whether there are results is questionable. Then your achievement may go unnoticed. You may have done something, but if it was not part of a strategy, when you have a strategy, there are many things that are happening. You're evolving something, you're changing something, you're implementing something, you're also communicating something. If it is an organization level change that is happening, you're making the noise, you're getting noticed. If you don't get noticed, you fail to make a dent in the market, even though you did something that was potentially very good. and you're sending confused signals, and that unhappy staff. I think the presentation that the students made in the beginning was very important. You have to carry your staff along with you. A top-down strategy does not work. You have to have an employee buy-in, because remember, they are your implementers. And then you have, your messages are wrong, these middle operational level people who are in touch with the market, they are the ones who are going to leave your customers very, very confused. So let me just very quickly say that Times Business Solutions is the entrepreneur within the enterprise. That was Times of India. Having worked with a large organization, when I came into this organization, what I really found was it was very easy to keep innovating. I could experiment, and there was a lot of space for innovation. Then one of the things that we did was, no portal was ever driven with content. So when I was brought in, I had about, 80% of the senior management were not in favor of having a person like me, who's more creative, who's not a core function at that point of time, being part of the organization. But the senior management decided that if you want to communicate with your customers, you have to have that channel of communication open. Somebody's vision, executed well, made all the difference. That gave us a kind of brand positioning as an entrant and a challenger brand, which otherwise maybe we may not have achieved so fast. Then, harvesting back-end data to drive research, creating mobile apps and mobile-friendly versions, giving up more traffic for the sake of quality traffic. Very bold decision. We actually went down in some of the com scores, because we said that we don't want mindless traffic, we want traffic that actually works and leaves our clients happier. And allowing advertisers to build brands using the power of content. We never believed that content could be sold, but we said that content has a power. Can we use content as an enabler for somebody to build brand? Because in Magic Bricks, as you know, the real estate industry is highly unevolved, very, very fragmented. If you want to build a brand, it was a big deal. You have to be friends with the market. Like I said, listen to your consumer. The product should work for the customer. You have to constantly innovate. You have to discard products that have lived their life cycle. Sometimes at the peak, when a product is very, very good, you sometimes withdraw it. Very much like the Maruti Zen. They withdrew the Zen at the height of its success because they knew that in the coming era, the Zen may not have been able to compete with the challenger brands. And experiment and don't let failure discourage you. And actually market cycles are very, very fickle. So let's set long-term targets, but achieve short-term goals. Because the short-term goals give you a sense of the employees, it gives them a sense of achievement, which otherwise they may not, you wouldn't be able to hold their interest. The Indian is an innovator. Jugaad is a short-term solution, but Jugaad works. The problem is when you don't take Jugaad and convert it into a long-term innovation. And the process should take over what started as an experiment. If the whole system works as an experiment and you continue in that mode, what will happen is it would not be able to achieve the scale that you wanted to achieve. And at the, like we said, it's the individuals who have the brain. In the morning we had the presentation which said that the individuals are able to innovate, right? Individuals have the knowledge within them. Any organization that captures the knowledge of the individual and holds it, processes it and pulls it into the organization, so that if an individual moves out of the organization, the process still remains. Maybe the next person will implement it in a different form, but it has to be something that flourishes. That's about as much as I wanted to say. I'm open to questions.
I have a point to make this time. If I can get the mic and I can have the power to mic. Ask earlier is something which is already answered in your this thing. The question was about you have a strategy in place. Question which I could not ask because the mic power was you have a strategy in place, and when you execute the strategy, it doesn't work sometimes. Then when do you decide that let's change course? If you don't succeed to begin with, then it becomes even more difficult to get the buy-in next time when you want to change course. So that is something which was answered when you were making the presentation. You said that there should be some short-term milestones, which create that euphoria and the engagement. So that question gets answered.
And make the noise. If every little achievement, make the noise. Internal noise is as important as external noise. If you make external noise, if you make there's a sound PR policy, your sales team is talking about it, it's the noise in the marketplace. But that internal noise, talk to people, tell the sales team. If you're in a research team, tell the sales team. If you're in a sales team, tell the marketing team that this is what is happening and this small thing worked. That noise is very important to get your buy-in.
That's a very critical point because when you got to change course, then if you have the buy-in of the team and the people, it becomes easier to get and change the direction. Now, the one of the thoughts which is coming is that while we talk about the processes and the strategy and all the intellectual work which can be done, at the end of the day, I also remember reading a couple of articles wherein it says that you get right people in the board, and rest everything will be taken care of. So, in terms of leadership and the strategy, shouldn't the starting point be that get right people on the board?
Getting who is the right person? I would say that when being heading a team of roughly about 18 to 20 people just doing research, the number of people I thought were absolutely spot on when I hired them were not really the right people. So it doesn't matter. Even if I got the wrong person, that person would have contributed something to my team, and that makes all the difference. If that person continues with me, if it is the right person, that person will continue. If that person is not the right person, but that person was taken on because of certain things that he was bringing to the table, then it's still worth the effort. So, can we always have the right people in place? I don't think so. I think with changing market conditions, with changing job roles, the right person becomes the wrong person. Maybe very, very diligent, but that person couldn't innovate fast enough. Maybe an innovator, but that person didn't have the staying capacity to continue when the market cycle was stable. So each person brings something to the table, but it's all right. If every person's contribution is documented within the organization, it still makes sense.
So I think the 2 points that was made is that humility as a virtue is very overrated. You're going to make noise when you're doing something new. And then of course you should start by hiring the right person in the board, then the right person as the CEO, the right person as a department head, the right salesman. That will all work. Yes?
Indian television scenario has been very competitive, and Arnab Goswami has managed to change the scenario and has given the lead to Times Now Group. So how do you see this success going ahead, and how do you plan to continue it strategically in coming 2 to 5 years, and what are the main success factors that it worked in India?
Arnab was a disruptor in more ways than one. And when Arnab, Times Now was the last entrant into that big league, right? Times Group had a lot going for it, but remember, it was part of we lent the name of the Times. Magic Bricks has no Times name. But Times Now was Times Now. The Times Group couldn't afford to fail, right? There were exceedingly good people. You had the Pranoy Roys, you had Rajdeep Sardesai, all people who had proved their success. You needed somebody who would disrupt the entire, you would stand it on its head and say, I can still succeed. And that's what Arnab did. Is that the only way to grow? I don't think so. But that was one way to grow, and that was one way to capture market share. But will Arnab be a disruptor for all times to come? We can't say. Today it is required, it is a formula that's working. That doesn't mean that the Times Group may not be working. I don't know for sure, I'm not part of that team. But we may be looking for alternatives to Arnab as well, at some point of time. But today, if it's a formula that's working and it hasn't played out its time, it's good to continue. But is Arnab the only success story in the Indian television news industry today? I don't think so. I think there are many ways to reach success. And just because one succeeded doesn't mean that's the only formula for succeed. Keep innovating. If your competitor has done well and you say, oh God, he's achieved it and I can't achieve that, that's not true. You can approach the problem in a different way, and then that will also lead to success.
All right, last question.
Yes, sir.
Madam, of course, the Times Now are doing so well. Do you think they have a vision of Times Now becoming India's equivalent of a CNN, or at least competing with Chinese CNBC?
We think we've already bypassed CNBC. We've overtaken CNBC as a
Chinese.
But that's not the point.
The global. I'm looking at a global print, not only in India, but something which the world can look at us as being something which we can give.
If you look at the Times Group, it is the largest, fully diversified, backward and forward integrated media group in the world. Whether you're television, radio, digital, outdoors, print, you name it, entertainment, news, features, you name it, we're there. But having said that, will be the day you decide that you want to go overseas, you would probably do well, but that's not the point. Again, it's a question of strategy. The Times Group works to a strategy, and today the strategy says that we need to consolidate our Indian story because India is doing phenomenally well, and Asia is where the growth is. Maybe we're looking at rest of Asia, maybe we're looking at more, going deeper into India. It really doesn't matter. It is a question of what your strategy determines in the long term, in the short term, and in the medium term.
Jayashree, thank you very much. That was really good. I now invite Dr. Lilac Nakul.
Did I say it right?
Environment situation to keep you awake now after these fantastic presentations, and just before lunch, I know our time already ran out, and it's time for us to have lunch. So I will bear that in mind. I promise I'll try to make it quick and with consideration of that. I was not planning to have a presentation, but last night I met Arvind, and I asked him, how should I present? And he said, you must have a presentation, and as much as I tried to argue with that, it didn't work out. So now I have a presentation, and it's probably it kept me all awake half of night, and it's certainly the last time I'm asking about whether how I should present. But at least it gave me some route for escape, because if there's something that you don't like about it, that's what happens when you put up a presentation in the middle of the night. So at least I have that. So really a pleasure to be here. Helping executives and companies go global is what I do for a living. And for the last few years, I've been really fortunate to have an opportunity to visit India, here in Seoul and in several other places. And have been looking a lot and thinking a lot about Indian companies and how they go global, particularly how they go international, and how they craft their strategies to go international. I want to share with you some of these thoughts, specifically three that I find particularly worthwhile. So the first one, I already forgot the lesson. So how should I move this forward? Doesn't seem to move. Up. Oh, okay, that's not true. Still doesn't move. This is the one. It goes back. The one goes backwards. It goes backward. Oh, that's the four. Sorry about that. Okay. So, yeah. So they have recently gone on an acquisition, what I would call an acquisition spree, and I'm sure you know about it. It doesn't get off the headline of everything, and the numbers are just mind-boggling. And every new one sort of breaks the records of the previous one. You can see. We still have the record, of course, to be broken. That still remains out there. But you see that it runs in the billions. The smallest one on the list here, which is the top 10, is more than $1 billion. And they received a substantial praise everywhere about this courage and sort of way of moving forward. And there's nothing, of course, wrong about that, and I don't have any issues with that by itself. Although I think it raises some question as to why such an exclusive focus on acquisitions, and it's what appears to be on the account of some other ways of going international, some other directions of going international. But the more troubling thing is maybe about how they handle these acquisitions. So they have taken a very deliberate approach of hardly touching the companies that they have acquired. And we have heard from Rajani the wonderful story about another company, a Western company that has taken a similar approach of expanding globally via acquisition. But I don't know if you have paid attention and if you thought about how many times Rajani mentioned the word integration in her talk, and how much attention Schneider pays for integrating the companies in which that they acquire. And I hear that from executives around the world that I talk to again and again in the United States and the Western world. How to integrate an acquisition is a major next step that comes naturally to them after acquiring. Not for Indian companies, not for other emerging companies as well, but specifically about Indian companies. There is a deliberate light touch, very, very light touch. All the management stays in place. There is minimal integration, as if we can't touch it in order not to ruin the very same thing that we have acquired. And they are using acquisition as a means for them to expand globally, and as a way to acquire the two most important assets that they need in order to become significant global brands and make successful global moves, which are technology and brand names. But by taking this, it's not at all clear that the approach they're taking is leading them towards this goal. Because if we look at what Tata Watan said about the acquisition of Dow, very explicit about not touching Dow. Tata Motor will operate Dow as a Korean company in Korea, managed by Korean, but it will work as part of a global alliance with Italian. A Korean company in Korea managed by Korean. And if we look at, are they getting what they sought out of these deals? Is not at all clear to me. And they seem to be aware of that themselves. If you look at. Okay. Again, Tata on Tetley acquisition. What's in it for us? A few years after the acquisition, it's really not clear what Tata got out of this. If the ultimate goal was to upgrade Tata, that was the goal that was declared at the time of the acquisition. If the ultimate goal was to upgrade Tata from the status of a commodity tea producer to a branded tea producer, we had hoped that there would be more synergy. That was happening, but not to an extent that would justify it. They pay a lot of money, many billions of dollars, as we just saw, in order to get the brand name and the technology, but there seems to be very, very little with it, to do very little with it. And here's another one. On Jaguar in the same spirit, 5 years on from Tata's takeover, Jaguar Land Rover, Glamour, and its success in selling in emerging markets near rich have done nothing to lift sales of Tata's own cars. So, is this really the route that is taking them to the desired destination of becoming ultimately successfully globally recognized multinational companies? It's not at all clear to me. And a comparison that we very often do is of contemporary multinationals to the previous generations of multinational companies. The Japanese in the 70s and 80s, and the South Korean in the 80s, in the more recent times. And these companies have taken a completely different path. They have gone through the very hard, long-term process of expanding internationally on their own. They've hardly made any acquisitions at all. They've gone almost exclusively through greenfield. And they've managed to turn themselves from what was at the time literally a joke in the West into most respected companies. Hyundai is today one of the highest selling car. Toyota has been the largest in the world for several years. There is a slight peak, but has reached this level again. And they have really taken the and we can mention several other names in this category. Acer from Taiwan. They've taken a very different route towards reaching the same goal, a much longer one, But I don't know how far these short-term cuts will really take Indian companies. And to use the example of Indian companies themselves, again in relation to Tata, one group within the Tata Group that has taken a very different approach is Tata Consulting, as you all know. This is a company that expanded internationally, neither no wings of anybody apart from it for itself. It went international, it came to the United States and introduced this remarkable body shop model that revolutionized the way the whole industry operates, and have grown that way. They have done recently more acquisitions, but that has been a minor thing to them. It in no way led their international growth. But if we look at the performance of Tata, or the contemporary performance of Tata, so by far the group that is leading Tata by far is Tata Consulting. The group that accounts to 50% of Tata's market value is Tata Consulting. And here I have some numbers to share with you. So in terms of net income, what do we see at the top? Tata Consulting, yeah? You see it here in the middle? Can you see? Yeah? And the same goes to marginal profitability. Again, the same story. Yeah? What happened to that? Pointed? Oh, okay. Yeah, again, the story of Tata Consulting. So again and again, we're seeing the same story, which brings me to the third and last point that I wanted to make, is about innovation. I keep hearing here in India, strangely enough, that Indian companies are yet to learn to be innovators. This is something that they're not good at. I keep hearing that from Indian business people that I talk to, from Indian thought thinkers about business. And it surprises me a lot, and raises my substantial objection. As I think that Indian companies are remarkable innovators. And they may not create the next version of iPhone or the next search engine, and they do leave that for the Googles and Apples of the United States. That's true. But there's so much room for innovation that they take, and they do it in a remarkably successful way, as if creating a wood burning that can sell profitably for $23 is not an innovation. It's as if doing the same to water purifying system, to refrigerators, to the nano, to cars. And these innovations in the process revolutionize industry. And we know that what the nano has done to the car industry will never be again after the nano was introduced. At the time Tata Ratan first came with the idea, people thought this is a joke. But today the entire car industry is trying to create the next nano. A next car that will run on the road for $3,000. So the nano has run, as you know better than anybody else, the nano has run into substantial difficulties. But the nano has revolutionized the way we think about cars, the way cars are being produced today. And the same goes to the other industries. And it doesn't end up here. Rural healthcare for $5 a visit. Innovation in the healthcare industry have been remarkable, truly remarkable. It's the first country in the world that has done provided healthcare services for prices that are affordable for the poor. And that requires enormous innovation. To do that in a profitable way, that takes enormous innovation. And cell phone for $20. And of course, we cannot have this conversation without talking about Airtel and a phone call for 2 cents a minute, which is about 10% of what it takes in the United States, and more profitable. I hope you can see the bottom line here. Yeah. Average profit margin. So, and I have a feeling that the approach that Indian companies take towards a global expansion, towards the exclusive reliance on acquisition, and particularly the way they manage the acquisition, has a lot to do with the perception that we are not innovators, that we cannot create our own technology, we must buy it from others, and we're so bad at managing it that we better leave it for the others to manage, because we can probably ruin that. I think Indian companies have much more going for them, and here are some examples to show that. And they should think about very different ways of going international and establish for themselves, for their own sake, their own global brand name based on their own created technology. Thank you.
We have a couple of questions.
Good afternoon. This is Amrikesh. I am Saul Anulunai. My question is that I have heard a lot about innovation. There is a lot of discussion whether this could be a part of strategy and can it be institutionalized. So my question is that does innovation can be institutionalized in any organization as a part of strategy? Is it possible to do that?
Innovation institutionalized in the organization is part of strategy.
I said as a part of strategy, can innovation be institutionalized in the organization?
When we heard in the survey of the students that achieving innovation is the first reason, and by far the first reason that most companies cited as the reason for introducing strategy in the first place. Companies create environment that foster innovation by way, this is an explicit part of the strategy, of course, of an institutional setup that they put in place. So yeah, certainly, it is certainly possible.
Also, if you look at companies like 3M, they have a whole business model which is constantly creating a foundation for strategy to grow. That's their biggest strength.
Yeah, Google also is very famous for letting people spend 20% of their time on creating innovation with the hope that that will foster some. So I guess that's what you're after. Yeah, that's the kind of strategizing of innovation that you have in mind.
Yeah.
Add to his point. My business head and I have this constant tussle. I tell him, if I don't plan for 5 years down the line, how can I be the head of research? And if he thinks of 5 years down the line and not today's profits, how can he be a good business head? A company that fosters innovation and allows, like she said, it allows an environment of innovation. That is part of strategy. But innovation cannot be strategy, because innovation by its very nature is something that is out of the box, impulsive, new, it breaks the mold. So innovation cannot be part of strategy, but to allow innovation certainly can be part of strategy.
All right, last question before lunch.
We hear you speaking a lot about Tata Group. As Indian nationals, we are really proud of Tata Group. But when we see you are also respecting Tata Group a lot, it is certainly nice to know about that. So what makes Tata Group so special and such a respected brand for global professionals like you?
Yeah, my students threatened me and they will ask many questions, so here they go. Yeah, and tough ones. They said that they would be tough ones, yeah. So here they go. I use Tata as an example, not because I hold Tata in particular in any special regard. I think Tata has been leading and as maybe more forerunner in terms of going global. Tata Ratan got enormous respect in the world. And one thing that is extremely respected for is these deliberate sort of statements of being very clean and honest and transparent about what he does. The whole transformation that he put in place of Tata after taking over and the focus, the moving away from being everywhere. They're still everywhere, as you know, but he has shrunk the number of groups to a quarter of what it was at the time he took over in the early 90s. In that regard, I think Tata deserve enormous respect. But I've used them as an example almost by rough accident, but there's nothing deliberate about Tata. And you know, we've spoken class about Reliance. I know a company that raises very different feelings here in India and around the world. But also has, as I emphasized in class, and I want to stress here, has substantial amount of things going for it. Also, and I also see there enormous innovation. I know that the cynics used to think that Reliance success is because it's very innovative in creating relationship with the government. But I think that we have seen them really having some very, very solid management innovation that enables them to break all the records of efficiency and achievements and implementation that largest, most sophisticated global companies have set up before them, and they have managed to beat that up. So that takes innovation too, and somehow it's gone unappreciated here, and I think you don't do justice to your own companies, and they don't recognize themselves the value that they have in doing that. So I don't subscribe to the view that Indian companies are yet to learn to be innovators. I think that they are in their own ways really important innovators, and they come to the world at a time when and that sets them apart from the South Korean and the Japanese and Taiwanese to an extent that preceded them. They come to the world at a time when there is much more to do in the world today with this kind of innovation than with the one that is developed in Silicon Valley, arguably. There is 85% of the world that is out there all thriving for a $70 refrigerator and $3,000 cars. This didn't exist for Toyota. That hardly existed for Kia and Hyundai. So they have enormous opportunity to take advantage of that, and they're second to none in these kind of innovations. They're really second to none.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Laila.
That was a wonderful and insightful foray into the world of strategy formulation, true to the words of Gurcharan Das. When an individual acts for the sake of his work rather than for the personal reward from it, Krishna says the individual is likely to do the right thing. This resonates with what Mr. Arvind Nair had spoken of when he mentioned that strategy enables organizations to create a game which is bigger than their quarterly profits and to come alive through that. Some other key insights from this session include the importance of creating a strategy that's well tuned to uncertainty, dynamic and adjustable, and how strategy is not so much only about doing things but also about not doing things. We also delved into topics such as the privileged insight source that we covered and frugal innovation, and I think all of that is quite a key takeaway for all of us. So, coming to the end of it, on behalf of the School of Inspired Leadership family, I'd like to express our heartfelt gratitude to each of the panel members for taking out the time to be here with us today and enabling us all to gain from their rich and diverse experiences and understanding.